Hey guys, Ramsey here. Welcome to another video. Today we have a vintage Hall of Fame review of one of the greatest masculine fragrances of all time, created by none other than Gerard Anthony, and this is Balenciaga Pour Homme. Now, many of you really love negative reviews, and yesterday I did a review on Eros Flame, okay, by the House of Versace Eros Flame, and I pretty much bashed it, as many people expect me to do, and I bashed Eros even worse, but those negative reviews get a lot of attention. People like them, but I'm here to say that love is a greater emotion than hate to me. Love conquers all, if you will. And some of my most loved fragrances have sat on my shelf and have not gotten reviewed on the channel. And I'm realizing that that is a very unfortunate approach that I took, because inside of me, I was always fearful that I would not do this justice. And so, you know what? I'm throwing caution to the wind. Not just this fragrance, but many of my favorite fragrances are left unreviewed on the channel. That is going to change. I am going to review some of my all-time favorites. It's really ridiculous when you think about it. So I'm just going to charge headlong. I'm going to talk about the fragrance. I'm going to give you some backstory on it. You know, if you're new to vintage fragrances, this All-Star or Hall of Fame series, whatever you want to call it, I think will be a great starting point for you to try to hunt some of these bottles down. And this fragrance is infamous in the perfume world. It was created by the great Gerard Anthony, who made fragrances from the past, like, for example, Aubusson Futuros, probably the greatest masculine barbershop fragrance ever created. One of the most brilliant uses of anise. And so Laura Cesaro and Gerard Anthony just created an absolute masterpiece with this from the late 70s, 1978. And then, of course, he also made stuff like Iquitos, which there are little touches of Iquitos in Balenciaga Pour Homme. I will say, especially the civet that's used here. You know, there's a little bit of dirtiness to Iquitos as well. And also, interestingly enough, there's a little bit of greenness in Balenciaga Pour Homme. You can see the green, the advertising on this actually shows things like snakes coming down from, you know, jungle-like snakes, airplanes flying over rainforest, lots of trees. You know, that was sort of the old advertisements of these old fragrances, masculine and feminine, are just stunning. I love the old adverts. So this is an all-star review. And again, one of the greatest masculine fragrances of all time. So no matter what I say in this review, I feel like I'm not going to do it justice. Honestly, that's how I feel. I feel like I could hit every single point, and I made bullet points here. I could hit every single point, and it still probably would not do it justice. That's how, to me, some of these all-star or Hall of Fame fragrances are near and dear to my heart. I have an emotional attachment to these fragrances. So when I'm reviewing it, sometimes it's very hard to discuss notes and this and that, because really, you know, some fragrances that are just in your collection that are towards the top, like Balenciaga Pour Homme, are just pure loves, an emotional, pure attachment love. Now, old school discontinued unicorn fragrance reviews are sort of a thankless job, because you basically have two schools of thought, two people come at you, other than the normal people who I love who leave comments and are here and supporters, but it draws other people to these type of reviews as well. On the one side, you know, you say things. I have people who have told me, I have literally had someone tell me, I only like this because it's discontinued. You wouldn't like it if it was still available. There's no way you would like this fragrance if you could just buy it right now, Ramsey. The only reason you like it is because it's discontinued. I've had somebody tell me that. I've also had somebody complain that why don't you talk more about fragrances like Balenciaga Pour Homme? You know, why are there no reviews on the channel? And then when the review ends up coming up, they complain about the fact that you've driven the prices higher on these discontinued fragrances now. $300, $200, $300, $400, $500 a bottle is insane, and it's all your fault. I used to be able to buy this for 50 bucks, and because of you, I can't. So it's sort of a little bit of a thankless job, because you do get some of the weirdos that are coming out of the woodworks, but I want to highlight this fragrance. I want to sort of give it its spot on the pedestal. I want to give it its flowers. I want to put the medal around its neck, because there are certain fragrances in my collection that deserve that attention and love. So one thing I should mention, there's a little bit of a, I would say, controversy about Balenciaga Pour Homme, if you will. And that controversy is Michael Edwards in 2015, who is widely regarded as one of the most, I would say, knowledgeable and famous perfume authors, and he's written books on perfume. He actually runs a database on perfume, which you have to pay a monthly fee to be a part of. That's really more sort of for insiders, but Michael Edwards is a huge name in perfume. He gave a speech, and I forget what the name was of the speech was called. I think it was like How the West Fell in Love with Oud or something. It was something like that. And so Michael Edwards gave this brilliant speech. The sound quality, if you find it on YouTube, is atrocious, but you'll be able to find, there's a part where he starts talking about oud. And one of the things that he says is that he has it on very good knowledge and very good sources that Balenciaga Pour Homme is actually the very first Western fragrance, of course, because Balenciaga is a Western house. I'm not talking like Middle Eastern houses and Atars, but the very first Western fragrance to use an oud accord, okay? And what's interesting is I actually have a tester bottle, okay? So you can see the notes on the back of my bottle, interestingly enough. And if you go down to the base, you'll actually notice that there is no oud accord listed. There's no oud listed. So what he says is that it's sort of a little bit of a experiment that they decided to undertake at the time, and they used this oud note for the very first time. Now, if you put a blindfold on me and put this in front of me and said, Ramsey, smell this and tell me if there's oud in it, I would probably say no, okay? But that, whether you think there's oud in Balenciaga Pour Homme or whether you don't, is almost like it's a moot point. It's a little bit of a moot point to me, because Balenciaga Pour Homme is beautiful and perfect exactly the way it is. So whether there's a little bit of oud, I will tell you this. One of the best arguments I've heard for an oud accord in Balenciaga Pour Homme is from my good friend Thomas from Early Greek. I would love to have you on the channel one day, Thomas. And by the way, if you want to learn more about Balenciaga Pour Homme, go watch Thomas's review of Balenciaga Pour Homme. But Thomas from the Early Greek channel, he was on a live stream once with Eugene and Rich Mitch, and they were sort of just talking about Balenciaga, as conversations tend to get steered occasionally in different directions on live streams. And this conversation got steered towards Balenciaga Pour Homme, and they were asking him about the oud accord. Thomas, do you think there's oud in there? And he said, of course, I don't know, but have you ever noticed how stable Balenciaga Pour Homme is? And I thought, that is actually a fantastic point, because, like I said, I have 3 bottles. Now, Balenciaga Pour Homme ran for about a decade, okay? So it was released in 1990. It was discontinued in 2001. So a little over a decade it ran, okay? He said, have you ever received a bottle of Balenciaga Pour Homme that smelled off or smelled different? Have you ever noticed how stable the fragrance is? 1990 was a long time, 33 years ago, right? And so have you ever purchased a bottle of Balenciaga Pour Homme? And there are people on that stream, like, for example, my good friend Rich Mitch has dozens of bottles of Balenciaga Pour Homme. And to me, I've never heard anyone say, oh, I got this bottle of Balenciaga Pour Homme and it smells off. No, nothing. And he said that he attributes that to the oud, that it adds this stabilizing factor to the fragrance. And you know what? That is a great point. I don't know if it's true or not, but I think it's a fantastic argument for a potential oud accord. Now, something else that I should mention is if you go to Fragrantica, or let's say you go to Parfumo, okay, and you look up the notes, right? I'll just read you real quick the notes on both. So on Parfumo, it has coriander, bergamot, and lavender in the top, with honey, caramel, jasmine, and lily of the valley in the heart, with benzoin, patchouli, sandalwood, and vanilla in the base. Now, I don't think that is a proper note listing. I love Parfumo. Parfumo is actually my most preferred site, if you will, to look up fragrances. I much prefer it to Fragrantica and base notes and stuff like that. Excuse me whilst I hydrate. Shout out to Rich Mitch. But I don't think that is a proper note listing. Never in my life have I ever smelled a caramel note in Balenciaga Pour Homme, okay? So I would probably classify this as a Oriental Fougere. I think it's a Fougere with Oriental touches, but I still have never smelled a caramel note in my opinion. So I think the note listing on Parfumo is wrong. Unfortunately, the note listing on Fragrantica is also wrong. It shows cinnamon, coriander, laurels, bergamot. I don't think there's any citruses in this. Cardamom, thyme, galbanum, and pepper in the top, with patchouli, sandalwood, cedar, and cypress in the heart, with honey, oak moss, labdanum, musk, and vanilla in the base. Now, that note listing, I think, is much closer to the truth. The only thing that I think it's missing is lavender. I think there is a lavender note in Balenciaga Pour Homme, and what's interesting, though, is I'm going to read you the notes from the actual back of the tester bottle. Now, this does not mean that this is every single note that's in the fragrance, because I think there is lavender in here. I also think there are things like galbanum, which is not listed on the back of the note listing. And so take this with a grain of salt, but this is the official note listing on the back of a tester bottle. Top notes: Ceylon cinnamon, and it's interesting that they designate Ceylon cinnamon, because the cinnamon note in this, and actually, if you follow the channel, if you have been following the channel now for however long I've been doing this, 19, 20 months, you will probably remember that I talk about that cinnamon, early 90s cinnamon note being very specific. And maybe we'll talk a little bit about that later on in the video. But the cinnamon in this is extremely, this is the way I like my cinnamon to be done, let's say. It is a top-notch cinnamon note. So the Ceylon cinnamon with Italian bergamot. Now, they list bergamot in here. I can tell you what, I don't think there's any citruses in this at all, because Balenciaga Pour Homme gets right down to the point, to my nose anyway. I don't, if it's there, it is completely swallowed up by the rest of the notes. Coriander and thyme in the top, with patchouli, sandalwood, cypress, and cedar in the heart. That is the heart that Fragrantica has, by the way, with a base of Yugoslavian oak moss, which is a very interesting fact that they specified Yugoslavian oak moss. Vanilla bourbon vanilla, amber, and musk. Now, you'll also notice there's something else that's very important in this fragrance that's not listed in this note listing, and that's honey. So they left out the honey, they left out the lavender, which I think there's 100% lavender in here. They left out the galbanum. There is some galbanum according to, Fragrantica. They left out the pepper, they left out the laurels, and so these are sort of the highlights. But you notice there's no caramel, there's no oud, there's no labdanum listed. Actually, I think labdanum is an important part of this as well. They do list amber, so they're probably just sort of including it in the amber. But that is the official note listing on the tester bottle of Balenciaga Pour Homme. So just, if you go to those sites and you look at some of the note listing, take it with a grain of salt when it comes to Balenciaga Pour Homme. And like I said, I think the lavender plays a big part in Balenciaga Pour Homme. And so, I don't think either site that you're using gives you a fair breakdown of the perfume. Now, on to the description. And I'm just going to speak from the heart, because I did make some notes, but honestly, this is one of those fragrances where I feel like if I try and be scientific about it, I'm not really going to portray the way that it makes me feel. So, to my nose, Balenciaga Pour Homme opens up with a detonation of spices. And I use that word very purposefully, a detonation of spices. That's how it feels. It feels like it detonates on your skin. As soon as you spray this fragrance, the spices just attack your nose in a good way. In a good way. It's not too spicy or anything like that, but the full-bodied sort of nutmeg, cinnamon, coriander experience almost gives you this, like I said earlier, I would describe it as an oriental fougere, okay? Which might sound a little strange, but that's how I described Russian musk whenever I did that review. Sorry, not Russian musk. That's how I described Musk Lave by Aries Ladore, because that had a very interesting lavender fougere feel, but it sort of had oriental touches. Balenciaga Pour Homme, now it doesn't smell anything like Musk Lave, but I would put it in that same category, that oriental fougere category. A little bit strange, but it's a good descriptor for Balenciaga Pour Homme, because this is not an aromatic fougere, right? If you smell something like Gucci Nobile, these type of fougères, these aromatic type of fougères, this is nothing like that. So I would not call it an aromatic fougere. Although I will say that there are some aromatic herbal facets from the lavender and the thyme. Thyme is a brilliant herbal note that's used. It's a beautiful masculine note in perfumery. Sometimes it can even have little leathery touches to it as the labdanum in the base, but this is not a leathery fragrance. Although there's so many, there's a whirlwind, a swirl, a tornado of notes in Balenciaga Pour Homme, and that's sort of how the notes come to you in a swirling fashion. So instantly you notice a lot of things start to happen at once. So as soon as you spray, you get this sort of, like I said, this detonation of spices that come to your nose, but it's smoothed out by that Ceylon cinnamon. The cinnamon note in here is top notch. Top notch. And so, like I said, instantly a lot of things happen at once. And even if you are one of the most perceptive perfume wearers on the planet, even if you spray and spend the whole day in your room smelling and making notes, you're probably going to have to wear Balenciaga Pour Homme about 20 times, okay, before you really feel comfortable with it. I was going to try to review this yesterday, and I wanted one more day. Even though I've worn this about 20 times already, like I said, I think you really have to wear this fragrance a lot because... And you have to make it your scent of the day. Don't just spray it on, wear it. I mean, let it become part of you when you wear it. Spray it on wherever you like to spray, the insides of your collars, your wrists, your hands, your clothes, spray it, wear it. Wear it as your scent of the day in different weathers because it does change in different weather conditions. So one of the main things to keep in mind as I describe Balenciaga Pour Homme in detail is that this scent I would call warm, spicy. Early 90s, right? Warm, spicy style. So that cinnamon coriander combo in the opening sort of takes the wheel and it doesn't want to let go. That warm, spicy coriander cinnamon combo is absolutely beautiful. That's the very first thing I noticed. No Italian bergamot, none of that. I didn't. If you the way I would describe this is there's no citrus, okay? It goes straight, like I said, a detonation of spice is the way that I experience Balenciaga Pour Homme. And I have talked about this sort of early style cinnamon before. So let me show you an example of these early style cinnamon fragrances. This is a perfect example of it. Romeo, Gigli, per Uomo. Now, this is a very interesting designer fragrance, but the cinnamon in here is outrageously good. Outrageously good. There's also a couple fragrances from the house of Aubusson. And Aubusson is a very interesting house because both of these fragrances I'm going to show you are discontinued. I think both of them have cinnamon in the note listing. I'm not 100% sure. Maybe the first one, Futuros, has only like spices listed, but there's this cinnamony like feel, right? But Futuros came out in the late 80s. And then in the early 90s, a couple years after Balenciaga Pour Homme came out, Aubusson Homme came out. And this is a very interesting creation because Aubusson Homme begins to smell a little bit like Balenciaga Pour Homme in the dry down. Not in the opening as much, but there is a cinnamon note in here that will give you shades of Balenciaga Pour Homme. Some beautiful early 90s cinnamon fragrances, but if you just take what I found interesting about the house of Aubusson, this is my favorite Aubusson by far, Futuros. This is from 87, I believe. But if you just take the color of Futuros, the marketing color, if you will, right? And you blend it with a little bit of the green, because there's some green touches in Balenciaga Pour Homme as well, right? The bay leaf or laurels or whatever it is, the galbanum, the cypress, that's a very medicinal fragrance. Matt talked about a minty note, and I don't think there's any mint in here, but what I do think is I think that the cypress gives it this sort of herbal, medicinal, cooling feel. I've talked a little bit about how cypress feels like you're smelling crisp trees in the winter. Like winter has like sterilized the dirty earth, and when you smell it, you get a little bit of this mentholated vibe from the cypress. That's what I think it's coming from in Balenciaga Pour Homme. But if you think about sort of the green touches in Balenciaga Pour Homme, and you take Futuros, and you take Aubusson Homme, and you blend these two together, right? These two, the way that they marketed these two, it really reminds me of that Balenciaga Pour Homme top, which we'll talk about this as well, because this is one of the great artwork pieces in fragrance history. So, just some interesting, if you're a fan of cinnamon, there are many early 90s cinnamon fragrances that are done like I've never seen them done since. the early 90s created some amazing cinnamon fragrances. And again, Romeo, Gigli per Uomo is one you should try to get your nose on if you're interested in smelling what Alberto Morillas used to be before he turned into the current Alberto Morillas that really pumps stuff out. He made that fragrance in the early 90s, and it's just absolutely stunning. So, like I said, not an aromatic fougere, but it does have that very interesting lavender thyme sort of combination with Balenciaga Pour Homme. And so instantly you're going to notice that, like I said, Balenciaga Pour Homme does not fool around. So what it does is it gets absolutely straight to the point, right? When you spray Balenciaga Pour Homme, it's like it's already going 100 miles per hour when it hits your skin. There's no leading you into the heart. There's no taking your hand and gently sort of bringing you in. No, I mean, this flies. That's why I specifically use the term detonate, because Balenciaga Pour Homme is a detonation of spices to me in the opening, and it has purpose, right? It races to your from the nozzle to your skin straight to your nose, and it's a thick, billowy sort of cloudy spice, and yet there's a smoothness to it. So there's this vintage cinnamon smoothness to it. It's absolutely one of the best spice openings I've ever smelled. And it also has these slightly green undertones, right? So there's like an undercurrent. There's an undertow of green little bits and pieces. Like I said, look at the color of the cap. Even the color of this Futuros cap sort of will give you an idea of the way Balenciaga Pour Homme, these sort of teal, greenish, blue. This swirl is an absolute perfect representation of what the fragrance feels like when I wear it. And so these slightly green sort of undertones come to your nose. And this is also, I think, one of the best works of art as far as a bottle, and just one of my favorite bottles. I love this little marbling on the top, and you notice each one's different. They're not just, you see how each one is different? They are not just cookie cutters. They're not exactly the same. They each have their own little touches and their own little little details, if you will. Almost like when you wear it on your skin, it's going to smell different from the next person who wears it on their skin, right? And so I love what they did with the cap. It's absolutely just, I think, perfect representation of the fragrance. Oh, that vintage cinnamon is so good. So slight green undertones, and the adverts. If you want to see some legendary advertisements, I would urge you to go check out some of the old school advertisements from Balenciaga Pour Homme. So the way that they marketed this, the slogan for Balenciaga Pour Homme was "The Power of Dreams." It's a very interesting slogan. I love that slogan. The Power of Dreams. And if you actually look at the cap, again, staying with the cap before we move on, imagine this sort of cap, if you will, blending into, so when you looked at the advertisements, they would take the cap and it would sort of blend, like, for example, one of them is a guy sitting on this rock, which rock and density and thickness is going to be a big part of Balenciaga Pour Homme, but he's sitting on this rock, but the actual fragrance is shown almost like this right here is like the streams of water that is, it's almost like the, like part of the water that he's sitting by. He's watching it go by. And I think sort of that watery, like if I didn't know what this fragrance was and I saw that, I would think this is an aquatic, especially being in the 90s, right? And I think that, you know, while I love the advertising campaign, I think some of it kind of threw some people off because they did this cool thing with the cap where it blended into, you know, parts of nature. Like I said, the water on one side. Another one was like these clouds in the background, almost like this was like clouds stirring together, right? And so the composition, if you look at some of those old advertisements, I love this tagline, "The Power of Dreams," but if you've never smelled it, it's nothing like an aquatic, and it's nothing like this airy ozonic fragrance that I think maybe they were sort of just following along with the marketing of the times, but the fragrance itself falls, instead of in the 90s, it really falls much closer to a vintage powerhouse from the 80s is really where it falls. So I recently did a review of what I called a vintage Hall of Fame fragrance from the house of Etienne Aigner, and it was called Super Fragrance for Men. Love that fragrance, but it's one of the few old school powerhouses from the late 70s, early 80s that doesn't use this honey, this vintage honey profile. And actually, I'm going to grab one real quick. I'm also going to turn on the light, so don't go anywhere. Okay, so if you think about these fragrances from the 80s that had this vintage old school honey use, right? Think about things like Boss No. 1, one of my all-time favorite honey fragrances. Love Boss No. 1. Think about things like Kouros. Kouros with that beautiful civet, one of the best civet fragrances ever created. Pierre Bourdon's masterpiece as far as I'm concerned. And this has a little bit of a honey note. It also has a little bit of this contrast between clean and dirty. And believe it or not, Balenciaga Pour Homme, for all of its sort of denseness and thickness and richness, and those are words I'm going to use over and over again in this review, there is something about it that has a little bit of this strange, I'm almost, it's almost like I don't even want to say it, but there is this tiny bit of this weird soapiness underneath. But it's so just hidden by this thick, dense, just imagine this thick rock that's in the way and the soapiness is in the back and you just can't see it, but it's kind of there. You can sense it, That's kind of how the soapy freshness of Balenciaga Pour Homme comes forward. But Kouros does exactly that. It plays with that contrast of dirty from the civet and then, of course, the freshness. Some people think that this is the story of a man taking a shower. It starts off dirty, it starts going cleaner and cleaner and cleaner with the aldehydes and all the other tricks Pierre Bourdon did. But yeah, there's this, clean, dirty contrast. And if you take something like, I know I mentioned Boss No. 1, but if you like Boss No. 1 and the honey in Boss No. 1, check out Paco Rabanne's Tenere. This is an absolutely brilliant fragrance. Not enough people talk about. And there's a beautiful vintage honey note in there. Think about something like Lapidus Pour Homme. Lapidus Pour Homme has a brilliant honey note included. It also has that fruity pineapple and a lot of other things going on. It's the original OG pineapple. Even something like Antaeus, my favorite fragrance of all time, has a beeswax note. So that sort of animalic vintage honey feel was very popular in the late 70s, early 80s, let's say. And these are the traits, if you will, that Balenciaga Pour Homme has. It's much closer to its friends from the 80s than it is from its friends from the 90s. And so it really feels like a vintage powerhouse frag from the 80s that just happened to be released in 1990. And so along with that bold, spicy opening, what your nose will be basically slapped awake by, and this is where the fragrance, everything starts happening very quickly in Balenciaga Pour Homme, and it's very hard to describe because it is extremely well blended, but it's also thick. Like imagine being up in a plane and you're trying to look down at the ground, but you can't because the cloud cover is just too thick. There's this denseness to it. But what your nose is basically slapped awake with is this brilliant, dirty honey with patchouli combination. And the patchouli, to me, in Balenciaga Pour Homme, I think it is one of the greatest patchouli notes of all time, to me. And, when you hear fragrance aficionados talk about how Balenciaga Pour Homme has this amazing opaque feel, you just can't see through it because it's so thick. Imagine trying to see through this cap. You can't, right? Can't see what's on the other side. And I think a lot of that has to do with this rock star patchouli note. It's dirty, it's dense, it's green, it's just this thick patchouli that weighs everything down, mixed with this sort of deep, resinous, sticky, they say amber. I think it does have this labdanum-like feel to it. Some people think it's the oud, right? But imagine that sort of, whatever you want to call it. Whatever you want to call it, just imagine that it sort of has this, this thickness to it, right? And interestingly enough, referencing Thomas again, because I really think he is one of, I would consider him one of the Balenciaga Pour Homme experts, if you will. He called this fragrance obsidian, which is a very interesting reference because, it's a very dense, thick stone that light can't go through, right? Obsidian is I just imagine this stone that just eats up the light, right, when it enters. It is not translucent, it's not transparent, it's not ozonic, it's not watery. It's the exact opposite of that. It's the exact opposite of a stained glass window. Light just gets absorbed, is the way that the fragrance feels when it wears on your skin. And that's really how it wears, that no citruses in the opening to my nose. It just jumps right into that amazing sort of nutmeg that keeps everything in the box. And it feels dense, and the spices have a bit to do with that. But again, I really feel like the patchouli has a lot to do with the way that the fragrance wears. And so what's so interesting to me about Balenciaga Pour Homme is it's at complete odds with what was popular at the time. So you have to remember that if you think about where Balenciaga Pour Homme fell on a timeline, right? It came after things like Davidoff's Cool Water. It came after things like, for example, Aramis New West. Balenciaga Pour Homme came after this. These were big hits, right? These sort of watery, ozonic, cologne heavy, aquatic, cologne-y, airy fragrances, lighter fragrances, really where the industry was starting to go. And so what ended up happening is Balenciaga Pour Homme came out, and it absolutely flopped in sales. So this was a commercial flop. Even though they kept it around for around a decade, it did not sell very well, apparently, is sort of what I've heard. And, personally, I think Balenciaga Pour Homme was insane for discontinuing this. I think they should have just stuck with it, because this is a flagship perfume. This is a signature scent perfume. I really feel like this is the kind of perfume where if you bought this in 1990 and this was your scent, this is the kind of fragrance that I think men would have continued to buy as the years went on. But it flopped. They only had it run for about a decade. Now, I personally think that, when you look at it again and after it got discontinued, as almost the year after it got discontinued, YSL M7 came out with their own Oud Accord. And that's the one that many people really will point to and say that's the point where Tom Ford, when he was working at YSL, brought Oud into the Western world lexicon, if you will, with M7. But again, there are people like Michael Edwards who say there was Oud in Balenciaga Pour Homme. And so now this dirty patchouli sort of, now that you're sort of getting the picture of what it smells like, right? Imagine this dirty patchouli, oak moss heavy, old school fragrance with spices and animalic civet and honey that belongs in the 80s, released in 1990. And just picture what you're probably picturing from the way that I described it is this very rough fragrance, right? With lots of sharp edges and stuff like that. And I think what makes Balenciaga Pour Homme so tough to sort of describe, if you will, is the texture of the fragrance and how it wears. And it's almost unique and singular in that aspect, at least to my nose. I don't think I've ever come across something that does what Balenciaga Pour Homme does to me, in the way it makes me feel and the way that it wears on my skin. So to my nose, that rich, dense sort of heft, if you will, almost wears like flour in a mixture bowl. All right, so imagine just putting dry flour in a mixer bowl and taking the whisker and whipping it up, right? And the flour just easily sort of rolls around the bowl, right? Or just imagine these clouds in the sky sort of intertwining with each other, right? So imagine you're looking at something like, I don't know, what type of cirrus clouds or something like that, right? And the clouds just sort of wisp together. And that's how I would say it doesn't wear like an airy fragrance, but the ingredients blend almost like cirrus clouds sort of coming together to intertwine with each other, where you know, you almost can't tell whether the cloud on the left or the cloud on the right, when they all come together and they're swirling around and everything, right? That's how people think you're seeing shapes and stuff like that. But it's expertly blended by Gerard Anthony. This is, to me, Gerard Anthony at his best. This is Gerard Anthony at his absolute best. This is his masterpiece fragrance to me. And Hall of Fame. This is the Mount Rushmore this is on Mount Rushmore of vintage perfume for me. And there is actually a brilliant article, like I said, on Fragrantica about Balenciaga Pour Homme. It was written this year. It was written by a gentleman named Sergei Borisov, okay? And he describes its base. He describes the base of the fragrance as this warm, sort of woody accord, which he says seems like a common denominator in traditional men's fragrances in the 80s. And while I agree with him to some extent, because I do think that it falls closest to its friends in the 80s, even some of the female friends in the 80s, like something like Teatro alla Scala with that chypre sort of beeswax civet, you know, this sort of big, bold type fragrance. Some of these even feminine fragrances from the 80s, I would say, have more in common with Balenciaga Pour Homme than the 90s counterparts, if you will. And so I agree with him to some extent. There is something that seems like a common denominator in the base of Balenciaga Pour Homme. There is something familiar about Balenciaga Pour Homme. So to me, Balenciaga Pour Homme is a year-round perfume. Chris from Scentland actually did a video where he wore it to the pool in summer, and he talked about that the fragrance lasted all throughout his wearing it to the pool, coming home, taking a shower, and he could still smell it, kind of thing, right? And he was making a point about how the eau de toilettes back in the day are so superior to even the stuff that they're coming out now, eau de parfum, extrait, all that stuff. But he was wearing it in summer. And I like to wear Balenciaga Pour Homme all year round. I don't necessarily put it only as a winter fragrance or anything like that. To me, this is a year-round perfume. This is a signature scent fragrance. There's something to me when I wear Balenciaga Pour Homme that's very comforting, very calming almost, if you will. Almost like you made memories while wearing Balenciaga Pour Homme in a previous life, right? And you instinctively know it when you smell it. You just can't exactly put your finger on what it is. You know, there's something there. There's something that you remember. Memory of the future, or whatever you want to call it, right? There's something extremely familiar about Balenciaga Pour Homme. To me, it's a timeless classic. You know, I can imagine men in the 90s rocking this. I can imagine men in today's age rocking it. I can imagine men in 2059 wearing Balenciaga Pour Homme. And it really feels like a fragrance that you wear when you want to sort of buck the system. You know, it's a fragrance then you want to go against the grain. You want to stand on your own 2 feet and say, I will not follow this or that, or I won't let you put me in this box, or whatever freedoms you want to stand up for. You know, it really feels like one of those fragrances that, because even when it came out, it was against the grain. From the very beginning when it came out, it was something that was against what was popular at the time. And so for me, I think about words like strength, and I think about words like power and elegance. There's like a timeless elegance to this fragrance. It's also potent as all get out. This is, so going back to what Chris from Scentland said, he says that, and I completely agree with him, this is actually a very important point, is these vintage eau de toilettes, this Balenciaga Pour Homme actually could be like a case study in why the modern fragrance houses are sort of taking us for a ride, because this stuff lasts 10 hours, easy. 10, 11 hours, easy. You spray it on, it lasts 10, 11 hours. You spray it on clothes, you'll be smelling it the next day, right? But nowadays, they want to put out the eau de parfum version because it's more concentrated oils. Then they want to put out the pure parfum. Then they want to put out the extra. Then they want to put out the eau de parfum intense. It's just bullshit is basically what it is. It's sales 101 bullshit. They're putting out more stuff so more people can buy more bottles. You know, I was doing the review yesterday of Eros Flame, and I was talking a little bit about Eros the OG, having the eau de toilette, and then of course Versace has to put out the eau de parfum, and then Eros parfum, and it's getting tiresome, this repetitiveness. And they didn't do that back in the day. Balenciaga would launch a men's fragrance in whatever it was, 1990. Sometimes they would wait a decade before releasing another masculine fragrance. And they didn't need eau de toilette intense because the damn thing lasted all day. And so, you're going to get 10 plus hours on many of these vintage masculines. To me, Balenciaga Pour Homme is an absolute shot in the arm. It is a shot in the arm of pure confidence wearing this. When you want to walk into a room, or when you want people to think that you work on like the millionth floor, or when you want to walk in the room and you want everyone to shut up because the boss is here. They know you're the boss, and when you walk in, everyone stops talking and looks at you, right? Or the meeting starts when you walk in. That's the kind of scent Balenciaga Pour Homme feels like to me. And I really feel like Gerard Anthony sort of perfected this funky, dirty patchouli with animalic civet, because there's a fragrance that he made a couple years before Balenciaga Pour Homme. I mentioned it earlier, Iquitos. But this has a civet note, to my nose anyways. Fragrantica, I don't know if they list a civet note. Let's see. Iquitos, is there a civet note? No, there's no civet note, which is crazy to me because this was the fragrance that was supposed to be Dior's Poison. It was actually competing for the same spot as Dior's Poison. It lost out to what, of course, ended up becoming Poison. And Alain Delon picked it up and turned it into Iquitos, right? And so there is definitely, to me, there's some civet in here. There are spices and patchouli and stuff like that. And so I think he was sort of working and perfecting this animalic civet, patchouli, spicy, woody-like fragrance with Iquitos, which came out a couple years before. And in Balenciaga Pour Homme, he sort of took it to the next level because he added this texture. Like I said, texture is a really hard thing in fragrance to convey, but he added this texture and this density. And he opened, really, I was going to say he opened Pandora's box, but it's almost like he closed Pandora's box, because it really feels like, imagine seeing like a star collapsing on itself, right? Just imagine how dense you could think, like in your brain, that must be, right? And all of the mass goes into that tiny little dot, right? That is actually how Balenciaga Pour Homme wears on my skin. This extremely thick, dense, rich, billowing clouds of spices and civet and old school sort of patchouli, dense, thick patchouli. It's just, the marketers on the cap and some of the pictures you see make this seem like water or this airy, and I think this could be star clusters, sticking with my star analogy. Think about something like galaxies swirling around each other, or they could be, what do they call those? Star nurseries where stars are born, right? You've seen some of those amazing pictures from the telescopes nowadays and stuff like that. It could be memories of a life well lived, swirling around each other. This could be, every sniff when you smell Balenciaga Pour Homme could easily bring you back to this photographic memory of a time and a place. And that's the other point that I want to make about Balenciaga Pour Homme for me, is that this is a fragrance designed for men back at a time when being a man was not a bad thing, when masculinity was not under assault, at least not fully yet in 1990. But this fragrance is sort of like an emotional perfume review for me, because, I feel like even if I pour my heart and soul into this fragrance, it'll never be enough. I'll never be able to truly convey Balenciaga Pour Homme to you. There will always be something left unsaid, some excuse to wear it again before I do the review, or, these sort of, whatever I say, it's not going to be good enough. These sort of thoughts have been going through my head for a long time on reviewing Balenciaga Pour Homme, and I almost had to force myself to wear the review and then to do the review. And then it ended up, I started really thinking about it, and I was thinking, Balenciaga Pour Homme and fragrances like this are made to be worn. They're made for, memories deserve to be made with this juice. It's so beautiful and so well crafted, And there's nothing like it today. Even some of the houses that have taken some of the old classics, like Roja Dove recently released a fragrance called Apex. And there's no doubt in my mind that Apex is the his reimagining of, let's say, Halston Z14, right? There's so much Halston Z14 in Apex. And I did a video on Italian Cypress. There's a lot of Halston Z14 in Italian Cypress as well. But even, I'm shocked, and maybe it goes to show the complexity of this fragrance and the ingredients that were used at the time by Gerard Anthony. And I think Gerard Anthony is one of the greatest perfumers of all time. Full stop. No, like, he's the greatest perfumer, but I mean, I think he is one of the greatest perfumers of all time, and he deserves much more accolades and love. This is, to me, Balenciaga Pour Homme is not a special occasion fragrance. It's not a fragrance for, you know, black tie event. It is a fragrance for black tie events, but it's not a fragrance for only black tie events. Balenciaga Pour Homme for me is sort of the, so sorry, my Texas accent, Jacques Conquier, who's the creator of Jacques Bogart, actually envisioned that this would be the modern masculine flagship of the house of Balenciaga. This is what men should smell like according to their creation. And even though it wasn't a commercial hit for me, I want Balenciaga Pour Homme to be remembered as one of the greatest masculine fragrances of all time. You know, I want it to have its spot in that vintage Hall of Fame. That's very important to me, that these type of fragrances, on my channel at least, get the limelight and deserve and love that they deserve. And it's really something that I put my heart and soul into this review. This review means a lot to me. It's something that I've been playing with for the longest time. What am I going to say? And ultimately, I just sort of had to write and speak from the heart, because that's what this fragrance really feels like to me. It's an emotional, that's one of the reasons I love perfume so much, is I can remember exactly what I was doing the last time I wore this. Not yesterday, of course I can remember yesterday, but the time before I wore this. I went and ate at a restaurant in Roanoke, Texas. You know, I remember all of these little details. This fragrance is like, you know, looking at a photograph on the dashboard and just instantly being brought back to that space and time. It is a special, special creation. And, you know, I know there's some people that are going to take both sides of the argument on price and, oh, you're smelling something that's 30 plus years old. How do you know what you're smelling? And, you know, vintage fragrances are where my heart is at for reasons like this. Very few fragrances can move me like this. And the reason I brought up, you know, Roja Dove earlier is even these houses that love taking these old school fragrances and reimagining them, nothing has been reimagined with Balenciaga Pour Homme. I've never smelled anything that makes me go, ah, Balenciaga Pour Homme. Like I said, there are maybe bits and pieces here and there of Aubusson Homme in the dry down, but even this is discontinued now. But when people ask me, Ramsey, is there anything like Balenciaga Pour Homme that I can buy? I don't want to spend $500 or whatever it is, $400, and I can't find a bottle. Is there anything I can buy? No. Balenciaga Pour Homme is literally singular. It is unique. It is on the Hall of Fame fragrance wall, vintage fragrance wall, for a reason. And so, you know, special shout out to Gerard Anthony for making something like this. And, you know, this is a video that I'm actually very glad and proud to do. And I'm going to do more. I'm going to review Kouros. I'm going to review Antaeus. I'm going to review my favorite honey fragrance of all time, Vintage Boss #1, right? These fragrances that are closest to my heart deserve reviews. They deserve it. And the fact that I've been pushing it off because I was afraid I wouldn't do it justice or whatever it may be is really ridiculous. But that shows how much these fragrances mean to me, that, you know, I want to do them. Obviously, I've been wanting to do these type of reviews for a long time, but I've often come up with some sort of an excuse. No more excuses. We are going to do this Hall of Fame video series, starting with, well, I've done a couple already. So we're going to have Hall of Fame series. We're going to have Vintage Hall of Fame series. Balenciaga Pour Homme, to me, on the Mount Rushmore of the Vintage Hall of Fame fragrances. Greatest of all, one of the greatest of all times from Gerard Anthony. So if you are one of the lucky few who have experienced Balenciaga Pour Homme, please leave a message. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'd love to hear if you experience it differently. You know, love seeing your faces in the comments. Thank you for the support. I know this is a long video, but some people sort of make fun of me because they know that the negative reviews are going to be the shorter ones. If it's like 20 minutes or less, I probably bashed it. And if I wax lyrically about it for almost an hour, you know I absolutely love it. Balenciaga Pour Homme deserves every second of this video. So thanks for watching, everybody. Cheers, guys, and I'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.